the daughter who came back to U.S. Margaret Ellison rose slowly from the cold ground, her knees trembling beneath her, but it was her heart that felt weaker than her legs. Every single day, while her husband was away at work, she walked the same quiet path to the cemetery. She knew it wasn't healthy to go so often, but she simply couldn't stop herself. Her daughter was buried there, her sweet girl, the one she couldn't save. Whenever she stood near that grave, she felt close to her again, even though she knew, deep down, that her daughter was gone forever. Her daughter's name was Emma. She had always been a gentle, quiet child, the kind who loved curling up with a book or losing herself in soft music. She never caused trouble, never raised her voice. But something shifted the moment Emma became a teenager. She began staying out later and later. Her eyes grew tired, her smile disappeared, and soon she barely spoke at all. Margaret and her husband, Robert, watched helplessly, terrified, unable to understand what had happened to their sweet little girl. Then one night, Emma came home violently ill. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Her face had gone pale as paper. Robert, a doctor by trade, called for an ambulance immediately and quietly begged the nurses not to tell a soul. He was ashamed, desperate to protect her, still clinging to the belief that everything would be fine, that all she needed was love, patience, and time to become herself again. After that terrifying night, they never let her out of their sight. They surrounded her with warmth and care, and slowly she began to seem better. She smiled sometimes. She ate dinner with them. They believed with everything in them that she was healing. But one night, they forgot to lock her bedroom door, and in the silence of that night, she slipped out through the window and vanished. When Margaret found the empty bed the next morning, she screamed and collapsed in grief. They searched everywhere: police stations, hospitals, shelters, the homes of every friend Emma had ever mentioned, but no one had seen her, no one knew a thing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years. Still, they never gave up hope. They kept her room exactly as she'd left it. Every night, Margaret lit a candle and wept in silence. Robert worked through his days and cried alone through his nights. Then 8 long years later, the phone rang. It was the police. They were asked to come identify a body. Robert and Margaret rushed to the hospital, hearts pounding, praying it was some terrible mistake. But when Margaret looked down at the girl on that table, she screamed. It was Emma. Her face had changed so much, but a mother never forgets. Her body was thin, broken, worn down by years of suffering. The report said she had died from illness brought on by drug addiction and starvation. She had spent 8 years living alone on the streets. After Emma's funeral, Margaret stopped speaking almost entirely. She became a ghost drifting through her own home, barely eating, never smiling, staring out the window for hours while clutching Emma's childhood toys. Robert grew terrified of losing her too. He called her every hour from work. He asked the neighbors to check on her. A heavy, suffocating sadness settled over their house like a permanent storm cloud. Then one evening, a homeless woman was rushed into Robert's hospital, bleeding badly and barely conscious. Another doctor on staff, Dr. Whitmore, refused to treat her, coldly claiming she wasn't worth saving. Robert exploded with anger, ordered him out of the room, and took over her care himself. He worked for hours alongside his team, refusing to let her slip away. The woman had lost a child recently. Her kidneys were failing. She had absolutely no one by her side. But Robert would not give up. He thought of Emma the entire time, and something in him decided that saving this stranger was something he simply had to do. After a grueling surgery, the woman finally opened her eyes. She had survived. Robert stepped outside afterward and felt, for the first time in years, a small flicker of peace. That's when a little girl approached him. She was thin, dirty, her hair a tangled mess. She asked softly, "Sir, would you buy my blood?" Robert stared at her, stunned. "What do you mean?" he asked gently. She answered, "My grandma is sick and we need food. I want to help her." Her name was Grace. Her eyes carried more pain than any child's should, yet she stood there, brave and unwavering. Grace led him to a crumbling little house nearby. Inside, her grandmother lay in bed, too weak to even lift her head. She whispered, "Please, don't let Grace be alone in this world," and then closed her eyes for the last time. Robert called for help immediately and brought both of them to the hospital, but tragically the grandmother didn't survive the night. Grace sat quietly beside her bed, not crying, simply holding her hand. The next day, Robert brought Grace home. He told Margaret, "She has no one left. Please let her stay with us just for a while." Margaret said nothing. She only stared at the little girl. But that night she made her warm soup, tucked her into bed, and sat beside her, watching her sleep. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't cry that night. She simply studied the child's face again and again, as if searching for something. The next morning, Margaret pulled out an old photo album and stared at pictures of Emma as a young girl. Her hands began to shake. She called out to Robert. "Look," she whispered. "She looks exactly like Emma did at this age." Robert looked closely at the photograph, and his breath caught in his throat. It was true, they could have been the very same child. Neither of them could speak. They simply wept. Margaret rushed back to the hospital and asked the nurses about Grace's grandmother. She found an older nurse who had sat with the dying woman in her final moments. The nurse told her gently, "She said something to me right before she passed. She said the little girl is the daughter of a woman who died on the streets years and years ago." Margaret's heart stopped cold. She understood exactly what that meant. She ran home and pulled Grace into her arms, whispering, "You're my granddaughter. You're Emma's daughter." Grace looked confused for a moment, then slowly smiled and hugged Margaret back with all her strength. From that day forward, everything in their home began to change. Hope crept back in. Light returned to their hearts. The grief never fully disappeared, but love grew stronger with every passing day. Robert smiled again. He read Grace bedtime stories every night and took her to the park on weekends. Margaret cooked all her favorite meals, bought her new clothes, brushed her hair each morning, and called her my girl. Grace felt loved again, truly loved. She finally had a real home, a real family. She never had to sell her blood again. She had everything she could ever need. Laughter returned to that house. Grace drew pictures and proudly showed them to Margaret. She asked endless questions, helped in the kitchen, danced to old songs from another era. Her joy, little by little, healed the broken hearts around her. Robert and Margaret felt, in some quiet way, that Emma had come back to them, not the same, but beautiful in her own way. One night, Robert sat alone outside and whispered up at the stars. "Emma, I couldn't save you, but I found your daughter and I will love her with everything I have." He closed his eyes and felt something like peace settle over him. Margaret sat beside him and took his hand. Together they watched Grace running through the garden, laughing freely, a sound that felt like music to their weary hearts. Grace turned and called out, "Grandpa, Grandma, come play with me." Robert rose slowly, smiling, and Margaret followed close behind. They chased after her, laughing in a way they hadn't in years. The garden was full of flowers now, and their home was full of love again. The past had wounded them deeply, but their future was now filled with hope. They had lost one daughter, but life had given them another to love. Every night, Margaret kissed Grace's forehead and whispered, "Good night, my little flower." Grace would smile and squeeze her hand tightly. Robert would sit by the window afterward, staring up at the stars, certain that Emma was watching over them. He'd whisper softly, "She's safe now, Emma. Don't worry anymore." The pain never left them completely, but now joy lived there too, and that joy was strong. They needed nothing more. They had found family again. They had found love again. Grace filled every empty space in their home with her laughter, giving two grieving, weary souls a reason to wake up smiling every single morning. Robert and Margaret knew they were growing old, but they also knew they still had more than enough strength left to protect this child. And every time they looked at her smile, they saw their daughter's face staring back at them, a face they would never, ever forget.